The laughter started before she even reached the formation line. Over 100 elite trainees watched her walk across the frozen parade ground at Fort Vanthorpe, and not one of them stayed quiet. She was 31 years old, 5'6", carrying a pack that outweighed half the men mocking her. Her left sleeve was rolled to the elbow despite the killing cold, exposing a tattoo that snaked from wrist to shoulder. A raven mid-dive, surrounded by symbols nobody in that yard could read. An instructor leaned toward another and said something that made 3 people laugh out loud. She didn't look at them. She didn't look at anything except the tree line at the edge of the mountain. Nobody in that yard knew what she actually was. They were about to find out the hard way. If this story already has you locked in, follow my channel, hit like, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The bus had no heat and no working window latches, and the road up to Fort Vanthorpe was 40 minutes of switchbacks that punished every pothole twice. Sergeant First Class Delia Marsh rode in the back row with her rucksack between her boots and her eyes on the neck of the man sitting in front of her. He kept shifting. Couldn't find a comfortable position. She noted this the way she noted most things, without deciding to, without doing anything with it yet. 22 trainees on the bus. Vanthorpe's winter selection cohort ran between 20 and 25. The attrition rate over the 12-week program sat around 60% in good years. She knew this from a pamphlet that had been slid under the door of a motel room in Reno 4 weeks ago, along with a handwritten note that said only, "Arrive ready, prove it." She'd read the pamphlet twice, memorized it, and burned it over the bathroom sink before checkout. The man beside her had been watching her since the fuel stop. His name tape read Dorset. Big, square-jawed, the kind of build that looked like it had been assembled for a purpose. He waited until the bus hit a long, flat stretch before he spoke. "First time doing selection?" "No," Delia said. He waited for more. She didn't provide it. "What branch?" he asked. "Army." "MOS?" She looked at him, just briefly. Her expression wasn't rude and wasn't warm. It was the look of someone who has answered this question enough times to be tired of the reason people ask it. "Medic," she said. Something moved across his face. Not contempt exactly, the early cousin of it. He nodded once and turned back to the window. She could see him filing it away. Female. Medic. Quota placement. He wouldn't say it out loud. The intake paperwork had covered that. But the thought was there, visible in the way he stopped asking questions. Fine. She hadn't come to Vanthorpe to make friends. The academy came out of the pine forest at 04:23 hours. Concrete buildings, corrugated training bays, one exposed parade ground sitting on the flank of a ridge, like someone had put it there as a punishment. Floodlights hit everything flat and white. The temperature was 11 degrees. Wind came off the upper peaks in long, sustained pulls that found skin through layering. They were told to form up before the bus finished stopping. Delia was second off. Ruck on her shoulders before the door fully opened, hitting the ground at that pace that wasn't running but wasn't walking either. The pace of someone whose body had done this enough times that the choreography lived below conscious thought. She moved to the formation line and found her position. That was when the laughter started, not erupting. Spreading, low, mean, deliberate. A short bark from the left, a few snorts from the trainees who'd arrived earlier by convoy and were already formed up. One comment she half caught, another response. By the time she was at attention, the sound had moved through the line like a slow current. Sergeant Culver walked the front of the formation, maybe 45, with the lean, weathered look of someone who had spent years outside doing unpleasant things and eventually just decided to live that way. He stopped in front of Delia, stood there, looking at her the way you look at equipment you're not sure is rated for the job. "Marsh," he said, reading her name tape. "Yes, Sergeant. You understand this is Vanthorpe Advanced Selection, not Field Medic Certification." "Yes, Sergeant." "You understand the attrition rate?" "Yes, Sergeant." He looked at her left arm. The tattoo ran from wrist to shoulder, a raven, black and angular, wings in a sharp downward arc, surrounded by a ring of symbols that looked like a language that didn't exist. He studied it for a moment. "Cute," he said. She said nothing. He moved on. The first 72 hours weren't designed to train anyone. They were designed to find who would fold. Pre-dawn runs up the mountain approach road in full kit. Cold water immersion in a tank that had probably never been cleaned. Math problems administered during stress positions. The math wasn't hard, but the positions made thinking difficult, and the instructors stood close enough that you felt their presence the way you feel a heat source, except the opposite. Delia moved through all of it without showing what it cost. This turned out to be a problem. In a group environment where suffering was the social currency, not suffering visibly read as arrogance or fakery. By the end of day 2, she had acquired a specific kind of attention from the other trainees. Not admiration, not even curiosity. The focused, resentful stare of people who've decided someone is cheating at something and can't yet figure out how. Dorset was the most visible about it. He'd paired off with a trainee named Renwick, tall, Nordic, spoke rarely. And the two of them had taken to positioning themselves near Delia during group events in ways that weren't quite coincidental. They rarely spoke to her directly. They didn't need to. The language lived in proximity and silence, and the occasional comment aimed sideways, calibrated to land just within earshot. Some people train their whole lives for this. Some people just fill a slot. Nothing wrong with filling a slot. Somebody's got to. Delia kept her push-up count without changing the rhythm. 38, she said to herself, because you were required to count aloud. Chief Warrant Officer Sarah Voss ran the performance evaluation track and had been at Vanthorpe for 6 years. She was 43, precise, and had the manner of someone whose self-assurance had been right often enough that it had hardened into certainty. She made her assessment of Delia sometime on day 3 and communicated it in the subtle, deniable language that people who are skilled at this use when they want to push someone out without leaving marks. It started with reassignments. Delia's kit was inspected twice as often as anyone else's. Her times were logged with specificity not applied elsewhere. During group evaluations, Voss positioned herself slightly behind Delia's left shoulder, close enough to register as pressure without crossing any documented line. None of it was explicit. All of it was real. Delia recognized the shape of it immediately. She had seen it before, in other configurations, in other places she could not discuss. The form changed depending on the environment. The shape stayed the same. She adapted by performing at 15% above whatever the standard required, because when someone is already looking for failures, you can't afford to operate at the margin. The cost was physical. By end of week 1, she was running on 4 hours of sleep per night, managing a left hamstring that had been tight since the cold immersion, and eating whatever the mess tent offered during the narrow windows allotted for food. You lost weight at Vanthorpe even when you tried not to. The body found its own fuel when the schedule didn't allow for proper intake. She ate everything on the tray and asked for more when they let her. One of the mess workers, a kid, maybe 20, watched her do this 3 days running and finally said, "You actually like this stuff?" "No," she told him, "but I need the calories more than I need the taste." He looked at her like she'd said something profound. She hadn't. It was just arithmetic. Week 2 brought the technical evaluations, and this was where blending in stopped being possible. Weapons familiarization first, disassembly, function check, reassembly of 5 platform types under time. Delia finished the first run 18 seconds ahead of the second-place trainee. She set the reassembled rifle down and waited. Didn't look around, didn't acknowledge the silence that had settled over the bay. Voss was timing. She looked at her stopwatch, looked at Delia, wrote something on her clipboard without changing her expression. Land navigation came next. Compass, map, pace count, no GPS, third run executed at night on unfamiliar terrain. The mountain around Vanthorpe had a way of making good plans look stupid once you were actually on the ground in the dark. Delia ran the night course clean. Every checkpoint, correct sequence, back at the release point 40 minutes before cutoff. Culver met her at this point with a flashlight and a look she couldn't entirely read. He checked her card without speaking. Then, "You've done this before." Not a question. "Land navigation," she said. "Yes. Not what I meant." She waited. He handed the card back. "Get to Chow." Woots. The rumor took 4 days to fully form, which was faster than she'd expected. It moved through the barracks in the way bad information always moves in closed institutional environments, sideways. through inference, attaching itself to existing prejudices and gaining specificity with each retelling. By the time it reached its final shape, it had acquired details that hadn't existed in the original version. The most popular variant held that she'd been given advance access to evaluation materials. A second version suggested someone in command had arranged her placement as a political demonstration, a manufactured success story for recruiting literature. The third version, which Dorset seemed to prefer, was vaguer but more persistent. The standards were being quietly adjusted around her. Everyone could see it, and the people responsible for watching weren't watching. None of it was true. All of it was believed. She heard fragments in the latrine, in the dark, after lights out, during the unstructured gaps between training blocks. She didn't respond to any of it. She'd learned years ago that responding gave it oxygen. You starved it by continuing to perform at the level that made the accusation absurd to anyone watching, without a prior commitment to the conclusion. The problem was that most of the people at Vanthorpe had already committed. The sabotage happened on day 16. She knew before she opened the kit bag. The weight was wrong. The distribution off in a way you felt before you could articulate. The way you feel a tire losing pressure before you can see it. She set the bag on her bunk and unzipped it without rushing. Her primary headlamp was missing the battery housing insert. Not the batteries, the housing. Unreplaceable with field materials. The lamp was dead weight. Her radio battery pack had been seated backwards in the carrier. It would power up clean on a quick check but drop signal under sustained transmission load. Not immediately, after roughly 10 minutes. Comms failure at the worst possible moment, and she wouldn't catch it until she was already on the ground. Both compass lanyard attachments had been cut, not frayed. Cut. Clean diagonal cuts with something sharp, leaving about a centimeter of loop. The compass would appear secured until she moved at pace, at which point it would separate and she'd lose it in the dark. She sat on her bunk with the kit spread across the olive drab blanket. Then she opened the secondary compartment of her rucksack, the compartment most trainees used for snack storage, and began swapping components from her backup kit. She'd learned to carry redundancies in a context she couldn't discuss. The lesson had cost something she didn't think about anymore. She didn't report the sabotage. This was a considered decision. Reporting created a formal process that would consume time she didn't have, generate attention that would be weaponized, and almost certainly produce nothing actionable because proving sabotage required a witness or a confession, and she had neither. What she had was a functional kit and a clear picture of who she was dealing with. She filed the information and moved on. The week's major evaluation was announced the next morning. A 12-kilometer ruck march over the East Ridge in full combat load, followed by a direct action exercise at the base of the far slope. Simulated assault on a defended position, blank fire. 12-person teams, rotating leadership, assessed individually and collectively. Delia was assigned to lead the final breach element. She assumed this wasn't an accident. The ruck march stripped away most of what people had spent 3 weeks constructing about themselves. When you've been climbing an ice-packed ridgeline for 3 hours in 40 pounds of gear, and the wind is working against you, and your hamstring has been talking since kilometer 6, the opinions you formed at the bottom of the hill become difficult to sustain. Dorset fell back at kilometer 8. Not out, he recovered, but his pace dropped below the required interval, and she saw it happen from 2 positions behind him. She didn't say anything. She noted it and kept moving. At the objective release point, they had 8 minutes to transition from march to assault posture. Kit reorganization, weapons checks, element brief, radio confirmation. 8 minutes was tight if you talked too much. She pulled her breach element into a crouch behind a snow-covered berm and kept the brief under 90 seconds. East access point, she said. I've been clocking the opposing force pattern since the ridgeline. They're running a 40-second rotation on the east observation post. That gives us a window. We move on my signal, not the exercise clock. A trainee named Garza, compact, careful, the kind of person who thought before he spoke, looked at her and said, "Exercise clock is the standard." "Exercise clock puts us into a position that's already been flagged," she said. "The rotation window doesn't." Garza held her gaze, then nodded. Dorset, who had arrived at the brief still catching his breath, said, "Who gave you the rotation pattern?" "Nobody," she said. "I watched." The window had 3 minutes left. He didn't push it further. She was right about the rotation. The east post swung away at 40 seconds. Predictable the way static positions always become predictable when they've been running the same pattern for more than an hour. Her element moved through the gap in a low-crouched file. Weapons up, spacing correct, pace fast enough to clear the exposure window without breaking noise, discipline. The exercise lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds. She learned later, through Garza, who'd heard it from an administrator, that the element's performance had placed in the top 5% of all recorded exercises at Vanthorpe in 3 years. He relayed this with the slightly careful expression of someone unsure how to deliver good news to a person who hadn't been expecting any. "That's the number," he said. "Okay," she said. He waited. "That's it? What else would there be?" He made a gesture that meant, I don't know, something human. Most people would show something. "I'm satisfied," she said. "I just don't need to perform it." He looked at her for a moment, then laughed. Short, real, the first genuine sound she'd heard at Vanthorpe in 2 weeks. "You're a strange person, Marsh." "Yeah," she said. "I know." The formal complaint was filed against her on day 21. Voss's signature. 3 specific incidents. Unauthorized deviation from evaluation protocol during the direct action exercise, failure to document a kit discrepancy, and conduct unbecoming during a peer assessment session that Delia barely remembered. The conduct item alleged she had been dismissive and contemptuous toward fellow trainees during group feedback. She read it twice, sitting across the desk from Major Elliot Pruitt, who ran the administrative track and had the look of a man who had inherited problems he didn't make and had been tired of them for some time. "You want to respond formally?" he asked. "Does the complaint pause my evaluation standing?" He paused. "Pending investigation, your status goes to provisional." Timeline? 2 to 3 weeks. She did the arithmetic. That puts me outside the current cohort window. If the timeline runs long, yes. She looked at the complaint form. 3 pages. The incidents described with a level of detail that required either an exceptional memory or contemporaneous notes. That told her something about how long this had been in preparation. "I'll respond in writing," she said. "I'll have it to you by tomorrow morning." Pruitt looked at her. "Most trainees request the verbal review." "Verbal reviews don't produce a paper trail," she said. Something shifted in his expression, not sympathy, the specific look of a man who has just revised who he's talking to. "Tomorrow morning," he said. She spent that night writing longhand, her thoughts organized better that way, and delivered 14 pages to Pruitt's office at 0547. No characterizations, no accusations, dates, times, positioning, frequency of assessment checks relative to other trainees, the sequence of incidents and their proximity to her evaluation milestones. She laid the pattern out and let its shape speak for itself. At 0600, morning formation. Culver called the roster and paused on her name. "Marsh." "Sergeant." He looked at her with that expression she still couldn't completely decode. "Block 1 is Technical Assessment Review. You're leading the medical trauma module." Behind her, Dorset exhaled. Not a word, just a sound. Low, controlled, the specific release of someone who has lost something and can't say anything about it. She filed into the bay and set up the module equipment without rushing, checking each item against the protocol she'd memorized in week 2. Garza fell in beside her. "You submit the response?" he asked. "This morning." "How many pages?" 14. A pause. "Maximum is 20. I said what needed saying." He picked up a tourniquet from the layout table, examined it, set it back down. "Voss is going to come at you again." "I know." "You have a plan?" She looked at him directly. "Garza, I've been managing this since before you knew this place existed." He held her gaze, nodded once, moved to his position without saying anything else. She found Culver on the perimeter road at 1940 during the free period before lights out. He was walking with his hands in his jacket pockets. Deliberate pace, no rush. The manner of someone who had decided on a conversation and wasn't going to be hurried into it. She fell in beside him. Neither spoke for a minute. The mountain air at this hour was different, calmer, colder, carrying pine and snow and something faintly like wood smoke from somewhere down slope. "You want to tell me what you're actually doing here?" he said. "Selection," she said. "Don't." She glanced at him. 8 years I've been running evaluations at this program, he said. Before that, I was doing the thing the evaluation is supposed to prepare people for. You understand what I'm saying?" "I understand." "Then you understand that I recognize what I'm looking at." He let that sit for a moment. "The rotation pattern on the direct action exercise. You clocked a 40-second cycle on a moving element at night from a ridgeline while you were 3 hours into a ruck. That's not something you develop in a garrison medical unit." The wind moved through the pines above them. Somewhere up the slope something fell. A branch, a small cornice, and the soft thud of it drifted down. "I pay attention," she said. "So do I," he said. He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. He looked up at the ridge where the direct action course ran, the terrain black against a slightly lighter sky. "The complaint resolves in your favor," he said. "Pruitt reads patterns, 10 days. After that, Voss will be careful for a while." He paused. "Careful isn't gone." "I know. What I don't know," he said, "is whether the people who sent you here thought through all the variables." She turned to look at him. His expression hadn't changed, but something behind it had. A layer had shifted aside, briefly, showing something older and more considered beneath. "Nobody sent me anywhere," she said. "Okay," he said, in the tone of a man accepting an answer he doesn't believe because he understands why the answer is what it is. He started back toward the compound. She fell in beside him. They didn't speak again until the lights of the buildings were visible through the trees. Then quietly, almost offhand, "Mission brief at 0400 tomorrow. Multi-element exercise. Command is running it personally." She waited. "Colonel Hargrove," he said, "and his full staff." Something shifted inside her chest. Not fear. Something more precise than fear. A focal point tightening. "Any particular reason the colonel runs a training exercise personally at 0400? She asked. Culver looked straight ahead. "I wouldn't know." He peeled off toward the NCO quarters. She stood on the perimeter road in the cold and the dark, the mountain rising above her, the wind steady off the peaks. Then she walked back to the barracks, lay on her bunk, and stared at the ceiling with her hands flat on her chest. Colonel Hargrove. She had no file, nothing documented, but she had information assembled over months from sources she would never name. Information that placed Hargrove at Vanthorpe for 3 years, that traced his previous posting to a specific theater during a specific window, and that put his name, once in a debrief summary she had memorized word for word, in proximity to an operation that had never officially occurred. She had not come to Vanthorpe to get certified. She had come because Hargrove was here, and what she carried, encoded in ink beneath a raven's outstretched wings on her left arm, was something that Hargrove, if he was who she believed he was, would recognize the instant he saw it. The question she hadn't been able to answer yet was what he would do after he recognized it. She set her internal clock for 0330, closed her eyes. Outside, the mountain wind moved through the compound in long, cold pulls, and somewhere above the tree line, the temperature was still dropping, and in 7 hours, Colonel Hargrove was going to walk into a briefing room and see a woman that everyone at this academy had spent 3 weeks trying to break, and he was going to know exactly who she was. What happened after that? She didn't know yet, but she'd find out at 0400. The alarm didn't wake her because she hadn't fully slept. She'd been in that shallow layer between rest and awareness, the kind of not-quite sleep her body had learned to use when the situation required it. And at 0328, she simply opened her eyes, sat up, and began dressing in the dark without needing to think about the sequence. Socks first, then boots, then base layer, then the rest of it in the order that made sense given what she knew about the morning. Around her, the barracks breathed the slow, heavy rhythm of people who were genuinely out. Dorset's bunk was 2 rows over, and she could hear him from here, deep, steady, the sleep of someone who had physically exhausted himself and hadn't spent any of his rest hours running calculations. She didn't envy him that. Not exactly, but she noted it. Outside, Vanthorpe at 0340 was a different place from Vanthorpe at any other hour. The compound lights ran on a reduced circuit overnight, enough to see by, not enough to feel watched. The temperature had dropped another 4 degrees since she'd come in from the perimeter road, and the snow that had been threatening all week had finally arrived in the form of a thin, dry layer that covered the parade ground in something close to silence. Her boots left clean prints walking toward the briefing building, and she noticed this the way she noticed most things, without assigning it meaning yet. The briefing room was in the main administrative block, second floor, east side. She'd walked past it a dozen times during the program and had never had a reason to go in. The door was heavy steel with a keypad entry and a small placard that said, Operations, Authorized Personnel. At 0347, the door was propped open with a rubber wedge, and warm yellow light came from inside, and she could hear voices before she reached the threshold. She stopped just outside. 2 voices. Male. The register of the second one was different from the first. Lower, more deliberate, with the particular cadence of someone who chose words rather than producing them. She stepped inside. The room held a long table, 8 chairs, a projector screen at the far end, currently showing a topographic map of the training range, and 4 people. 2 junior staff officers she didn't recognize. Culver, standing near the far wall with a coffee cup and the specific expression of a man who had been here for a while and had decided not to look surprised by anything. And at the head of the table, studying the topographic map with his hands flat on the surface and his back partially toward the door, Colonel Aldrich Hargrove. He was taller than she'd expected, broad through the shoulders in a way that had less to do with deliberate training and more with the natural architecture of a man who had spent years doing physical work. His hair had gone gray at the temples, and his uniform was pressed to a standard that didn't require effort anymore. It was just how his uniforms looked. He hadn't heard her enter, or if he had, he was choosing not to acknowledge it yet. One of the junior staff officers looked up. "Trainee?" "Marsh," she said. "Sergeant First Class. Assigned to morning brief." The officer looked at his roster sheet, a pause that lasted long enough to be a statement. "You're early." "Yes." Hargrove turned. She had prepared for this moment, in the way you prepare for things you can't fully prepare for, by deciding in advance that her face would give him nothing until she understood what she was dealing with. She held that. She kept her expression at the professional neutral that was the appropriate register for a trainee reporting to a colonel, and looked at him with exactly as much information in her eyes as she intended to. He looked at her, and his face did something she hadn't predicted. It didn't show recognition. It showed the controlled absence of recognition, the specific stillness of someone who has just seen something and is actively managing their response to it. She'd been watching people suppress reactions for long enough to know what suppression looked like from the outside. It looked like nothing. But the quality of the nothing was different from actual nothing, and Hargrove's face was doing the first kind. "Marsh," he said. "Sir?" "Sit down." She sat. Culver, across the room, did not look at her. He looked at his coffee cup with the focused attention of a man who had decided to be very interested in coffee. The other trainees arrived between 0355 and 0400 in clusters of 2 and 3, filling the remaining chairs with the shuffling, squinting energy of people pulled out of deep sleep. Dorset came in at 0358 with his hair still flattened on one side and his eyes carrying the particular hostility of someone who had not had enough time to construct his morning armor. He sat, saw Delia already seated, and his jaw tightened by a degree that she clocked and filed. Hargrove began the brief without preamble. The exercise was a full-spectrum operation, multi-element assault on a simulated forward operating base approximately 9 kilometers north of the main compound, across terrain that included 2 creek crossings, a ridgeline approach, and a final 500-meter open approach to the objective. 3 phases. Phase 1 was movement to the release point, assessed individually on pace and noise discipline. Phase 2 was a deliberate breach of the outer perimeter. Phase 3 was a hostage recovery element working against an opposing force that would have freedom of movement within the objective. The twist, and Hargrove delivered this without any particular theatrical weight, just information, was that the opposing force for Phase 3 had been given the trainee roster and the standard breach timelines in advance. They knew where the trainees were expected to come from and when. "Standard timelines are compromised," Hargrove said, looking around the table. "Adapt accordingly." Dorset raised his hand. "Sir, If the OPFOR has the standard approach vectors, the Phase 3 plan is already blown before we start. What's the intended workaround? Hargrove looked at him with the measured patience of someone who had heard this question in various forms for many years. That's what you're here to figure out, trainee. Dorset put his hand down. Hargrove looked at the table in general, but the look traveled in a specific direction for a half-second, toward Delia, and then away, in a movement so controlled it would have been invisible to anyone not watching for it. She was watching for it. They had 40 minutes between the brief and the movement order to plan, prep, and eat, if they were going to. Most trainees grabbed food. Delia went to the map table. The topographic sheet showed the 9-kilometer approach route and the objective layout. She had 90 seconds with it, which was enough. She traced the main approach vector with her eyes, noted the 2 creek crossings and the ridgeline exposure, then spent the remaining time looking at what wasn't on the standard approach vector, specifically a drainage running northwest to southeast that connected the lower tree line to the objective's blind side. It wasn't marked as a route because it wasn't a route. It was a drainage. Probably wet at the bottom, certainly rough, probably added 30 minutes to the movement time. She walked away from the map and found Garza by the door, eating a protein bar with the focused efficiency of someone who understood that calories right now were a tactical resource. "Look at the drainage on the northwest," she said quietly. He looked at her. "That's not an approach vector." "No. It's 30 minutes longer." "At least." He chewed for a moment. "And you think that's worth it because the OPFOR is expecting the standard vector?" "I think it's worth considering," she said. "Whether it's worth it depends on Phase 3 timing." He was quiet for a moment. "Who's leading Phase 3? She didn't answer because Culver had just appeared in the doorway and was looking at the assembled trainees with the expression of someone about to deliver information that wasn't going to make anyone happy. "Element assignments," he said. "Dorset, you've got Phase 1 lead. Renwick, Phase 2, breach command. Marsh, Phase 3, hostage recovery." The room didn't go completely silent. It went to that specific frequency that a room reaches when something has been said that everyone has an opinion about and nobody is ready to voice it yet. Dorset looked at the floor. A muscle in his jaw worked once. Delia said nothing. She picked up her kit bag from beside her chair and began her final equipment check. The 9-kilometer movement took 2 hours and 14 minutes. The terrain earned every minute of it. The first creek crossing was knee-deep and slow-moving, but the rocks underneath had the particular instability of a stream bed that flooded and receded regularly, which meant the footing was never settled. The ridgeline approach ran through a section of pine forest where the snowfall had flattened lower branches into unexpected obstacles, and the gradient was steep enough that maintaining pace required conscious effort. Delia moved in the middle of the formation. Not the lead, because Phase 3 wasn't her element yet, and she had no standing to make navigational calls during Phase 1. She moved at the required interval, managed her breathing, and spent the time watching the terrain and running calculations. The drainage was going to work. She'd made that assessment on the ridgeline when she'd been able to see the northwest face of the objective from elevation. The OP4 had 3 observation posts visible, one on the south, one on the east, and one on what should have been the primary approach from the northwest. What they didn't have, because the drainage was not a recognized approach vector, was coverage on the blind side of the objective where the drainage terminated. It would add time. It would remove exposure. The question was whether her Phase 3 element would trust the call, because the call was going to look wrong from the outside. It was going to look like the long way around chosen by someone who didn't know the shorter route. And she couldn't fully explain the operational reasoning without revealing a level of tactical analysis that would invite questions she wasn't ready to answer. At the release point, the 3 elements separated. Dorset took his people left. Renwick took his forward. Delia's Phase 3 element assembled around her. 6 trainees, including Garza, plus a trainee named Solis, who she'd barely spoken to, but who moved well and wasted nothing. She kept the brief tight. "We're not going in on the standard vector," she said. Silence. "The northwest drainage," Garza said. He wasn't asking. "Yes." A trainee named Poole, heavy-set, competent, with the expression of someone who had strong opinions and was deciding whether this moment warranted them, said, "That's 30 minutes we're not going to have if Phase 2 runs on timeline." Phase 2 won't run on timeline, she said. The OPFOR knows the breach points. Renwick's element is going to hit contact earlier than the exercise plan assumes. We'll have the time. Poole looked at Garza. Garza looked at Delia. How do you know they'll hit contact early? Poole said. Because if I were running the OP4 and I had the standard breach timeline, I'd push my forward security element 20 meters outside the perimeter on the primary breach axis. You don't wait inside for someone you know is coming. You meet them. The silence that followed had a different quality from the one before. Not disagreement, something closer to recalibration. Solis, who hadn't spoken, said, "That makes sense." Poole looked like he wanted to argue with that assessment, but couldn't find the seam to get into it. "We move in 4 minutes," Delia said. "Questions?" Nobody had questions. Okay. The drainage was worse than the map suggested, which was how terrain usually worked. The bottom was not just wet. It was a narrow corridor of ankle-deep mud overlaid with snow that concealed the depth until you were already in it, and the walls on either side were steep enough that you couldn't use them for support without disturbing the brush in ways that generated noise. They moved in single file at a pace that was slower than she wanted and faster than the terrain made comfortable. Garza was directly behind her. At one point, about 10 minutes in, he said very quietly, barely above breath, "You've moved through drainage before." She didn't respond. He didn't ask again. The drainage terminated 30 meters from the blind side of the objective in a low berm of accumulated debris, fallen timber, compressed snow, the accumulated output of whatever ran through here during wet season. She brought the element to a halt behind the berm and signaled for silence with a closed fist. From here she could hear the exercise. Not clearly, but enough. The flat crack of blank fire weapons from the east side told her Renwick's element had made contact, and the volume and frequency told her the contact was heavier than the exercise plan had scheduled. She'd been right about the OPFOR pushing their security element forward. What she hadn't anticipated was that the contact would create enough noise and attention to pull 2 of the 3 observation posts toward the east side of the objective, which meant the south post was currently the only active coverage on the approaches she could see. She looked at the south post. Estimated distance, 60 meters. 1 OPFR trainee, running a visual pattern that swept left-right every 20 seconds. Standard, predictable. She pulled Garza up beside her and pointed. He watched the pattern for 1 full cycle. Nodded. "Go on the sweep right," she said, "through the gap on the left. We're inside before he comes back left." "And the hostage element?" "Structure on the north interior. I saw it on the topo. 1 entrance east-facing, which means it's currently oriented toward the firefight, which means whoever's guarding it is watching the wrong direction." Garza was quiet for a moment. "You saw all that from the map table?" "Yes." "You had 90 seconds at the map table?" "Yes." He didn't say anything else. He moved back to position and relayed the breach timing to the element in the compressed, minimal language of people who have stopped needing full sentences. 20 seconds. The OPFOR observer swept right. Delia moved. Chet. The Phase 3 exercise ran 11 minutes and 30 seconds from the drainage breach to the hostage element's extraction. By the standards of the exercise plan, it should have taken 22 minutes and required a direct engagement with the primary OP4 defensive element. Instead, her team had moved through a gap that the opposing forces' plan hadn't accounted for. Isolated the hostage structure during a moment when the OP4's attention was fully committed to the east side contact, and extracted all 4 simulated hostages through the drainage exit before the OP4 realized Phase 3 had been executed. The after-action review happened at the objective, with the combined elements reassembled and the exercise controllers working through their notes. The lead controller, a senior warrant officer named Gretsch, who had the manner of someone who found most things mildly disappointing, ran through the phase assessments in sequence. Phase 1, adequate. 2 trainees had fallen below required pace interval on the second creek crossing. Phase 2, compromised. Early. Offer contact had disrupted the breach timeline, as she'd predicted, and Renwick's element had managed a partial success at the cost of extended contact time. Phase 3. Gretsch paused on this one. He looked at his notes, then at the drainage, then at Delia's element, then back at his notes. Phase 3 element took an unplanned approach vector, he said. Yes, Delia said. The drainage. Yes. That's not an approved approach vector. No. Gretch looked at her with the expression of a man who was deciding something. Walk me through the decision. She did. Briefly. OP for Advanced Security Deployment predicted early contact on Phase 2, observation post pole to the east, drainage as the only approach vector without natural observation coverage. She kept it under 2 minutes because the element was standing in the cold, and 2 minutes was enough. When she finished, Gretch wrote something on his notepad and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, outcome was a clean extraction with 0 simulated casualties. Yes. Against an opposing force that had the standard plan in advance. Yes. He wrote something else, then noted. He moved on to the consolidated assessment. Delia looked straight ahead and did not look at Hargrove, who had been standing at the edge of the assembled group for the entire after-action review with his hands behind his back and an expression that had not changed once in 40 minutes. She could feel him looking at her. She did not return it. Also, the return movement was conducted in silence, which was the natural register of people who had physically spent themselves and had several hours of cold terrain between their current position and anything resembling comfort. Delia moved in the formation without speaking to anyone, managing her hamstring, which had escalated from tight to a persistent low ache somewhere around kilometer 4 of the return, and running the morning back through her mind the way you run a room back through your mind when you're trying to find something you left behind. Hargrove had seen her. She was certain of that. What she wasn't certain about was what he'd done with it. The controlled suppression in his face when she'd entered the briefing room could mean a dozen different things. It could mean recognition, the right kind, the kind that meant he understood what the tattoo meant and who carried it and what her presence here implied. It could mean recognition of a different kind, the kind that meant he knew what she represented and intended to address it on his own terms and timeline. It could mean something she hadn't calculated for, which was the possibility she'd been sitting with since the pre-dawn hours on the perimeter road. She didn't have enough yet. Back at the compound, the trainees dispersed toward the mess tent and the barracks and the shuffling, hollow-eyed procession of people at the end of their physical resources. Garza fell in beside her without preamble. The after-action, he said. What about it? Gretch's face when you walked him through the drainage decision. She waited. He wasn't surprised, Garza said. He was something else, like he'd seen that kind of thinking before and wasn't expecting to see it again. She didn't respond to that directly. Instead, she said, Did Dorset say anything during the return movement? Garza's expression shifted slightly. He said you got lucky, that the OPFOR pulling toward the east contact was a variable you couldn't have predicted. What did you say? I said that predicting that variable was the whole point of the decision. What did he say to that? Nothing, Garza said. He stopped talking. She nodded and pushed through the door toward the mess tent. Voss found her after chow. Not in a formal context, not with the official bearing of an evaluation officer conducting a documented interaction. She appeared in the corridor between the mess tent and the barracks building with her hands loose at her sides and the particular expression of someone who has been waiting for a specific moment and has decided this is it. Walk with me, Voss said. It wasn't a request. Delia fell in beside her without comment. They went toward the administrative block, away from the trainees filtering back toward barracks. The snow had stopped sometime during the exercise, and the compound was sharp and quiet in the afternoon light, every surface clean. Voss waited until they were far enough from anyone else before she spoke. The complaint process is going to resolve in your favor, she said. I assume you know that. I was informed. Pruitt is methodical. Voss's voice was flat. Not angry. Something more controlled than anger. He sees patterns. You gave him a well-organized document, and he'll follow it to its conclusion. Yes. That doesn't change your standing here. Delia looked at her. Doesn't it? Evaluation standing is separate from the administrative process. My assessment of your performance is based on what I've observed in the field, and my field assessment has been documented, Delia said, in detail, with timestamps. Voss stopped walking. Delia stopped beside her. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The wind moved between the buildings in a thin, cold stream, and somewhere across the compound, a door opened and closed. You think you've built something, Voss said. A case. A paper record. I've documented what happened, Delia said. That's different. Is it? Yes. A case implies I want something from the documentation. I don't want anything from it. I want to complete the program. Everything else is just information in the right place. Voss looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was harder to read than anything she'd shown during the evaluation blocks. Something in it had moved past the procedural into something more personal, more honest. The look of a person who has been in a contest and has just registered that the other person may be playing a different game entirely. You're not what they said you were, Voss said. It didn't sound like a compliment. It sounded like an assessment being revised against the speaker's preference. No, Delia said. I'm not. Voss turned and walked back toward the administrative block without another word. Delia watched her go for a moment. Then she turned the other direction, toward the barracks, and had covered maybe 20 meters when she heard her name from behind her. Not Voss's voice this time. Hargrove. He was standing at the corner of the administrative block in his service coat, alone, without any of the junior staff that had accompanied him all morning. His hands were in his pockets, and he was looking at her with an expression that had finally dropped the controlled suppression from the briefing room and was showing something underneath that was harder and older and more direct. She turned to face him fully, but didn't move toward him. He walked to her, stopped at a distance that was close enough for a private conversation and far enough to be unremarkable to anyone watching from the compound. He looked at her left arm, where the sleeve was rolled to mid-forearm, the lower portion of the tattoo visible, the raven's tail feathers, and the beginning of the symbol ring. When did you get assigned? He said. His voice was very quiet. She held his gaze. I didn't get assigned anywhere, sir. Don't. The word came out with more weight than its size suggested. Not anger, something that had been compressed for a long time. I know what that is on your arm. I know what it means. I know what unit carries it. He paused. I thought they were all gone. The wind moved between them. A thin, dry cold that had been building all day and was going to be serious by nightfall. Most of them are, she said. Something passed across his face, brief, contained, the internal movement of a man absorbing information he'd been carrying a weight about for a long time. Why here? He said. Why now? She looked at him steadily. There's a question I need answered, sir. I've been trying to answer it through channels for 2 years. There are no channels left. His jaw tightened. What question? Not here, she said. He looked around the compound. A slow, practiced assessment that took in angles and distances and the positions of people without appearing to do any of that. Then he looked back at her. Tomorrow. Oh, 600. The equipment shed at the north perimeter. Come alone. He walked back toward the administrative block without waiting for her response. She stood where she was and watched him go and felt, for the first time since the bus ride up the mountain, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel before now. Not relief, not vindication, but the specific sensation of a door opening in a building she'd been circling for 2 years. In the cold, in the dark, waiting for someone on the inside to finally turn the lock. She didn't know yet what was behind it, but she was going to find out at 0600. And somewhere in the barracks at that moment, she knew Chief Warrant Officer Voss was sitting with her own thoughts, rewriting her assessment of a woman she had spent 3 weeks trying to remove, and arriving, slowly and against her will, at a conclusion she wasn't going to like. In the mess tent, Dorset was eating and saying something to Renwick that made Renwick nod, and whatever it was the last version of the story where Delia Marsh was someone you could afford to dismiss. That version was running out of time. She didn't sleep well. Not because of anxiety. Anxiety was the wrong word for what she felt lying on her bunk in the dark, listening to the barracks settle around her. It was something closer to the state you reach when you've been waiting for something for a long time, and the waiting is almost over, and your body doesn't know how to treat that as rest. She lay still. She kept her breathing even. She let her muscles recover even if her mind wouldn't fully stop. That was the discipline. You couldn't always control what your brain did in the hours before something significant, but you could control whether your body paid the price for it. At 5:40, she dressed in the dark and moved through the compound toward the north perimeter. The equipment shed sat at the far edge of the training area, partially screened by a stand of pine trees that had grown up against the wire fence over the years. It was used for overflow storage, vehicle recovery equipment, spare barrier materials, the accumulated hardware of a facility that acquired things faster than it discarded them. The door was unlocked when she got there. She went inside without knocking. Hargrove was already there. He was standing near a set of metal shelving with a small tactical flashlight sitting base down on a shelf, pointing upward, which gave the space a dim and serviceable light without announcing itself to anyone outside. He had a thermos and 2 cups, and had apparently decided that whatever this conversation was going to be, it warranted coffee. He poured one and held it out when she came in, and she took it because the temperature outside was in the single digits, and she'd been moving for 6 minutes, and the warmth in the cup was useful regardless of the context. She didn't say anything. Neither did he, for a moment. He poured his own cup and looked at the shelving like he was organizing his thoughts against the physical objects in front of him. Then he said, "Spectre." 1 word. He said it the way you say something you've been not saying for a long time, with the specific quality of release that comes when a word has been held back so long it's developed weight. "Yes. She said, "Unit 8 specifically." "Yes." He looked at her then. In the flashlight's indirect glow, his face was all planes and shadows, and the expression on it was not what she'd expected from a man in his position confronting what she represented. It wasn't defensive, it wasn't calculating. It was the expression of someone who had been carrying something heavier than they'd let on, and had just been given permission to set part of it down. "I thought the unit was destroyed," he said. "The operation in Sector 12. The official report said—" "I know what the official report said," she told him. "I was there when they wrote it." His jaw tightened. "How many came out?" 3, then 2, then me." He was quiet for a moment. The equipment shed made small sounds around them. The settling of metal in the cold, the faint vibration of wind against the corrugated walls. "The operation in Sector 12 wasn't a failure," he said. "It wasn't entirely a statement. It had a question inside it." "No," she said. "It was a decision." The silence that followed was the specific kind that comes after someone has said something that confirms what the other person already suspected and didn't want confirmed. Hargrove put his coffee down on the shelf. He didn't pick it up again. "Who?" he said. "That's the question I've been trying to answer for 2 years," she said, "and the reason I'm here." She told him what she could tell him, which was not everything, because some of it she still didn't know, and some of it she'd learned in ways that produced information she could use but couldn't document. She told him about the debrief that happened in a basement room in a building that wasn't on any federal directory, 8 months after Sector 12, when she'd been medically cleared and operationally dormant, and had enough distance from the event to start organizing what she'd seen into something approaching sequence. She told him about the name that appeared in the authorization chain. Not a name she'd seen directly, but a name that could be inferred from the structure of the order set if you understood how the authorization chain worked at that level, which she did because she'd worked inside it for 4 years. And she told him that the name sat at a level of the institutional structure where she had no access, no leverage, and no standing, unless she could establish a foundation inside the selection program that gave her proximity to the people who did. Hargrove listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he stood with his hands flat on the shelf edge and looked at the floor for a moment. "You think I have access to that chain?" he said. "I think you were in proximity to Sector 12 during the operational window. I think your name appears in a document adjacent to the authorization set, and I think you've been here for 3 years, at a program like this when your record suggests you should be 3 levels above this posting." He looked up at her. "That's either a lateral reassignment," she said, "or something removed you from the main track. I'm here to find out which." The silence held for a count of 5. Then Hargrove said, "That took considerable preparation." 2 years, she said. "Yes." He studied her for a moment with the assessment of a person recalibrating in real time. "And if I'm not what you think I am?" "Then I finish selection and find another way," she said. "But you recognize the tattoo. And you're here at 0600 in an equipment shed instead of reporting what you know to program command." So, something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the structural ancestor of one. "There are 2 people in the authorization chain I can access," he said. "One of them I trust. One of them I don't. What I can tell you is that the Sector 12 decision didn't originate at the operational level. Someone above the operational tier signed off on the exposure and then signed off on the report that buried it. Do you know who? I have a name, he said. I've had it for 2 years. I haven't been able to move on it because I have nothing that functions as evidence. Only inference from the same kind of structural reading you just described. She looked at him steadily. What's the name? He looked back at her for a moment. Deputy Director Kaylin Morse, he said, Defense Acquisition Oversight, former liaison to the Covert Operations Authorization Board. She hadn't heard that name before. She held it in her mind the way you hold an unfamiliar weight, gauging it, finding the balance point. I need time to verify, she said. I know. He picked up his coffee again, finally. How long are you planning to stay in the program? Through completion, she said. The selection record is part of the foundation. I need it documented. Voss is going to make that difficult. Voss is already less certain than she was, Delia said. She told me herself yesterday. Hargrove looked at her with an expression she was beginning to understand was his version of surprised, a very slight adjustment in the set of his face, barely perceptible, which in anyone else would have been wide eyes and an open mouth. She said that to you directly? She said I wasn't what they said I was. In context, that was the same thing. He absorbed this. Then he said, There's a full spectrum exercise scheduled for day 31. Live opposing force, multi-environment, command staff, as observers. I had input on the scenario design. A pause. I may have made certain scenario parameters more complex than the standard template. She looked at him. The exercise is designed to be failed, he said flatly, by a standard trainee. It is not designed to be failed by someone with your background. You designed it for me. I designed it for whoever you actually are, he said. I didn't know who that was until yesterday morning. She processed that. And if I run it the way it needs to be run, then the command observers, all 5 of them, including 2 who have the institutional standing to initiate the kind of review that can access the authorization records you need, will have watched you perform at a level that establishes your standing. In writing. Witnessed and documented. She looked at him for a long time. That's a significant risk for you, she said. Yes, he said simply. He didn't add anything to it. She nodded once. Day 31. He picked up the thermos and his cup and moved toward the door. At the threshold, he stopped without turning around. The people who wrote the Sector 12 report, he said, they believed there were no survivors. I know, she said. That belief has protected you. I know that too. He left without another word. She stayed in the equipment shed for another 2 minutes, finishing her coffee in the dark, listening to his footsteps diminish across the frozen ground. Then she walked back toward the compound, and the cold was very serious now, and the sky above the mountain was the flat gray of a morning that wasn't going to get much brighter, and she had 9 days until day 31. 9 days to stay in the program, stay under the radar, and not give Voss or anyone else a reason to move against her before the exercise that Hargrove had quietly built into the schedule like a mechanism waiting to be triggered. 9 days. She could do 9 days. But she almost didn't make it to day 28. The thing that nearly ended it wasn't Voss, which was what she'd been managing around. It wasn't the complaint process or the evaluation blocks, or even Dorset, who had settled into a sustained cold hostility that was unpleasant but manageable. It was her hamstring. Day 24, during a vehicle extraction drill that required a fast dismount and a 200-meter sprint to a covered position, the left hamstring finally stopped complaining and started refusing. Not a full tear. She would have known immediately if it had been a full tear, the way you know when structural things fail, with a pop and a specific type of fire that leaves no ambiguity. It was a grade 2 strain, which meant she could still walk and still function within a range of movement, but sprinting at full capacity on it was going to cause exactly the kind of damage that would end her participation in the program on medical grounds. She knew this because she was a medic, and she'd seen this injury enough times to read her own tissue accurately. She also knew that reporting it meant a mandatory medical hold, which meant removal from the current cohort, which meant she would miss day 31. So she didn't report it. She taped it herself in the latrine the morning after the drill, with supplies from the medical kit she carried as a matter of habit, using a compression wrap pattern she'd learned from a physical therapist in a context she couldn't discuss. Then she modified her gait slightly. Not enough to be visible at distance, but enough to reduce the load on the compromised tissue during the training blocks. She ate ibuprofen on a schedule and slept with her leg elevated on her packed rucksack and did the self-assessment every morning that told her whether she was managing it or making it worse. She was managing it. Barely. Garza noticed on day 25. He didn't say anything directly. He just appeared beside her during a break in the tactical communications block and said, without looking at her, "Your left foot is landing 3 degrees outward from normal." She said nothing. "I've been watching you walk for 3 weeks," he said. "I know what your normal looks like." "I'm fine." "That's not what I asked." "I didn't hear a question." He was quiet for a moment. "You're going to get pulled if a medical officer notices." "Then I need to make sure a medical officer doesn't notice," she said. He looked at her then, directly, with the expression of someone who has decided to be involved in something even though the rational position would be to stay out of it. "What do you need?" She considered this for longer than she would have under normal circumstances, because asking for help in an environment like Vanthorpe had costs that needed to be weighed against the benefit. "Don't walk beside me during assessments," she said finally. "If you're next to me, the evaluators are going to compare our movement and they'll see the difference." "That's all?" "That's enough," she said. "And don't tell anyone." He nodded and walked away, and she watched him go with the specific feeling of owing someone something that she couldn't repay in the currency available. Day 27 brought a complication she hadn't planned for, which was the only kind of complication that actually mattered. Sergeant Dorset filed a formal performance challenge. This was a program mechanism she'd been aware of but hadn't assessed as a real threat. A provision in the Vanthorpe selection regulations that allowed a trainee to formally challenge the recorded assessment of another trainee if they believed the documentation didn't reflect observed performance. It was rarely used because using it created enemies, and the social math of selection programs usually made that cost too high. Dorset apparently had decided the cost was acceptable. The challenge specifically cited the Phase 3 exercise from day 22, the drainage approach, the extraction outcome, and argued that the performance record should be annotated to reflect that the approach deviation had constituted a procedural violation that invalidated the result. He had found 2 other trainees willing to co-sign the challenge document. Their names were on the bottom of the page. She was given the document by Pruitt's aide in the corridor outside the mess tent, which she noted was not an accident in terms of location, being handed a formal challenge where other trainees could observe it was a statement as much as an administrative process. She read it once, standing in the corridor, folded it, put it in her left cargo pocket, went to chow. She ate with the focused efficiency she brought to all meals at Vanthorpe, working through the tray without looking up, processing the challenge document in the part of her mind that ran parallel to the rest of her functioning. The argument it made was technically narrow, but strategically reasonable. If the Phase 3 deviation could be reclassified as a procedural violation, her assessment record took a hit that would be visible to the command observers on day 31. It wouldn't remove her from the program. It would complicate what Hargrove was trying to build. Garza sat down across from her with his tray. "I heard," he said. "News travels." Dorset told Poole. Poole told everyone else within about 8 minutes. He paused. "Solis is angry." "Solis doesn't need to be." "Solis was in your element on the Phase 3 exercise. Dorset's challenge implies the whole element's performance is procedurally compromised. It's not just about you." She looked up from her tray. Garza held her gaze. He may have miscalculated who he was making enemies of. She hadn't thought of it from that angle. She considered it now. Dorset had aimed at her and hadn't accounted for the fact that his aim passed through 5 other trainees on the way. Solis, specifically, was not a person she'd have chosen to make angry if she were Dorset. Compact, focused, with the kind of controlled intensity that had been quietly building a record that put her in the top third of the cohort. She hadn't said much to Delia, but she'd been watching, and what she'd been watching had apparently registered. "I'm going to respond to the challenge formally," Delia said. "I don't need Solis to do anything." "She might not give you the choice," Garza said. He was right about that, as it turned out. Solis came to find her after chow, in the corridor outside the barracks, with the direct manner of someone who had made a decision and was implementing it. "He named me in the co-compromise implication," Solis said. "My performance record is attached to your element's record. He compromises yours, he compromises mine. Yes, Delia said. I co-signed nothing. I was never approached. No. So he filed a challenge that has consequences for people who had no say in it. That's accurate. Solis looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone running through options rapidly. I'm going to request a formal interview with the evaluation board, she said. As a member of the Phase 3 element, I have standing to provide a performance account. Garza and Poole will do the same. Poole co-signed the challenge, Delia said. Solis blinked, then her expression flattened in a specific way. Poole can make his own decisions, the rest of us can make ours. She walked back toward the barracks. Delia watched her go and felt something that she hadn't felt much of at Vanthorpe. Not warmth exactly, but the recognition of other people exercising judgment independently and arriving somewhere useful. It wasn't what she'd expected. She'd come in expecting to do this mostly alone, and she was still mostly doing it alone, but the mostly was shifting in ways she hadn't fully planned for. The formal response to Dorset's challenge occupied her evening on day 27. She wrote it with the same discipline as the complaint response. No characterizations, no emotional register, just a documented reconstruction of the tactical decision-making sequence with specific reference to the after-action data, the OPFOR deployment pattern, the Phase 2 contact timeline, and the extraction outcome. She added one section she hadn't planned to add until she was 3 pages in and realized the omission would weaken the document structurally. She documented the sabotage from day 16, not as an accusation, as a timeline entry. She noted the equipment condition, the nature of the modifications, the resolution through backup kit, and the date. She didn't name anyone. She noted that she had chosen not to report the incident at the time and stated the tactical reasoning for that choice. She submitted it the following morning. By afternoon, the evaluation board had received formal interview requests from Garza, Solis, and one other trainee she hadn't expected, Renwick, who had been Dorset's primary ally since week 1 and whose request constituted a quiet, devastating piece of information about where Dorset's support base had actually been. She found out about Renwick's request from Culver, who appeared beside her during the afternoon land navigation block and said, without any particular tone, Renwick submitted a statement. She kept walking, her compass bearing. In favor of who? It's a factual account of the Phase 3 timeline, Culver said. Make of that what you will. She made of it exactly what it was. Dorset had miscounted his allies. Day 31 began before dawn, which was how all the significant days at Vanthorpe began. The briefing assembled the full cohort, 17 trainees remaining from the original 22, attrition having taken its expected share through injury and voluntary withdrawal over the preceding weeks. The command observers were seated along the left wall, 5 officers, 2 of whom Delia had identified over the past week through the kind of lateral research available inside an institutional environment. Major General Thessa Warren, who ran the Oversight Division and had the precise bearing of someone who had gotten where she was by being more rigorous than everyone around her. And Brigadier General Paul Ostergaard, whose name appeared in certain oversight documents she'd pulled from the accessible records in the administrative office during a block when she'd had a legitimate reason to be there. Both of them had institutional standing that mattered. Both of them were here. Hargrove ran the brief himself. The scenario was more complex than anything the cohort had encountered in the preceding 30 days. Delia could see this in the faces around her as the parameters were laid out. A simulated hostage situation involving 3 separate structures on the North Training Range, each containing a different element of the simulated crisis, each requiring a different approach and a different set of skills to resolve. The structures were not co-located. The movement between them would require simultaneous multi-element coordination. The opposing force had freedom of movement across the entire range. One additional parameter: communications were restricted to a single encrypted radio frequency shared across all elements. If any element compromised the frequency, used non-standard protocols, broke radio discipline, transmitted in the clear, all communications went dark for the remainder of the exercise. Standard trainees would rely on the shared frequency. Losing it would collapse the coordination. She had been trained in a system that assumed communications failure as a default state. She had 4 years of operating in environments where the radio was the thing you planned around losing, not the thing you planned around keeping. Hargrove looked around the room during the brief with the neutral expression of a man delivering standard information. His eyes crossed hers once. She looked at the map on the wall and began building the sequence. Element assignments were announced. Dorset got the northern structure, the straightforward one. Renwick got the eastern approach. Delia got the center structure, which was the most complex, with the highest OP4 density according to the scenario parameters and the least favorable approach geometry. She noted that Dorset looked satisfied by his assignment. She noted that he had not yet understood what his assignment was actually telling him about how the scenario was weighted. She was on the range by 0620 with her element, Garza, Solis, and 3 others, moving through pre-dawn cold that had gone from serious to punishing overnight. The temperature had dropped below 0 and the wind was back, coming off the upper peaks in gusts that made sustained movement expensive. Her hamstring was talking at a volume she was managing to override. She'd wrapped it tighter before leaving and had taken the maximum reasonable ibuprofen load before moving. It would hold. It had to. The center structure sat on a flat bench of terrain surrounded by tree cover on 3 sides and open ground on the 4th. The open ground faced north, which was where the scenario parameters suggested the primary approach vector lay. The OP4 deployment, according to the scenario, had concentrated on the north face. She didn't take the north face. She'd been looking at the structure in the aerial photograph included in the scenario brief, a standard overhead image showing the layout, and had noted a detail in the shadow patterns on the east wall that suggested a secondary access point not marked on the structural diagram. Shadow patterns from overhead photography showed variations in wall depth that were easy to miss if you were reading the diagram rather than the photograph. The east wall had a secondary access point. The scenario brief had not mentioned it. The OP4 deployment had not covered it. "We're going in from the east," she told her element at the release point, crouched behind a snowbank in the tree line with the structure visible 200 meters across the open bench. Garza looked at her. "The scenario map doesn't show an east access. The photograph does." He absorbed this. "You saw it in the brief photograph?" "Yes. One photograph. This morning." "Yes." Solis was looking at the structure. "The OP4 line on the north is visible from here. 3 positions. They're expecting us from that direction." "I know," Delia said. "If the east access is wrong," Garza started. "It's not wrong," she said. Not with arrogance, with the flat certainty of someone who had read the image correctly and knew it. He looked at her for a moment, then, "Okay." She moved first. The element followed in sequence, crossing the open bench in the compressed, low-profile movement of people who understood that visibility was their enemy, using the angle of the tree line shadow to remain off the primary OP4 observation arc until they were close enough that speed replaced concealment as the primary tool. The east wall had the access point, a recessed service door, unguarded, situated outside the OP4 coverage arc because the coverage arc had been designed around the structural diagram, not the actual structure. She put her hand on the handle, looked back at her element, 5 faces, cold-reddened, alert, waiting. "Tight," she said. "Stay tight." She opened the door. What happened in the next 19 minutes was not the result of a plan that executed perfectly, because no plan executes perfectly, and hers had 2 moments that came apart and required real-time reconstruction. The first was a secondary OP4 element inside the structure that the scenario parameters hadn't indicated. An additional 2-person team positioned in the interior corridor who had been added, she realized later, as a live variable to test adaptability. She encountered them at the second interior junction, and the 2 seconds of adjustment required to reorient her element cost her the coordination signal she'd planned to use for simultaneous breach. She scrapped the simultaneous breach on the move, redirected Garza to hold the corridor with Solis, while she took the remaining 2 members of her element through the interior stairwell to the upper level where the simulated hostages were located, and ran the extraction single file through the structure's east exit, which she'd identified during the approach as the cleanest withdrawal route. The second problem was her hamstring, which on the stairwell decided that the ibuprofen and the compression wrap had done what they were going to do and that the rest was on her. The pain that came up the left leg on the 3rd step was significant. Not incapacitating, she'd felt worse and kept functioning, but the kind of pain that takes a percentage of your processing capacity just by existing, and she couldn't afford the percentage. She kept moving. The extraction took 4 minutes from the interior contact to the east exit, with all 4 simulated hostages and all 6 element members intact. She cleared the exit and moved the group behind the berm on the east side and did a count and found the count correct, and then stood still for a moment with her left hand braced against the berm wall, not because she needed the support structurally, but because her leg had earned a single second of accommodation. Garza appeared beside her. He looked at her hand on the wall. He looked at her face. He looked back at the structure. He said nothing. "Clear?" she asked. "Clear," he said. She pushed off the wall and moved to the radio. The after-action assembly brought the 3 elements and the command observers together at the central staging area at 0912. Dorset's element had completed the northern objective on timeline. Renwick's had hit significant OP4 resistance on the eastern approach and had completed with 2 simulated casualties. Delia's element had completed with 0 casualties against a higher OP4 density than either of the other objectives, through an access point that had not been in the scenario brief. Major General Warren was the senior observer. She conducted the review personally, which was not standard for a training exercise, and her questions were precise in the way that suggested she had been watching closely enough to ask about specifics. She asked Delia about the east access point identification. Delia explained the shadow analysis from the brief photograph. Warren asked about the interior corridor redirection when the secondary Alpifer element appeared. Delia explained the breach modification on the move. Warren asked about the extraction route selection. Delia explained the egress geometry. Warren looked at her for a moment after the last answer with an expression that was completely unreadable, which Delia had come to understand in people of Warren's seniority was not blankness, but active processing. Then Warren said, "Where did you train before this program?" The question landed in the assembled group like a stone into still water. The ripples of it went out in all directions. She could feel them in her peripheral awareness, in the slight shifts of posture and attention around her. She met Warren's eyes directly. "I'd prefer to answer that in a smaller setting, ma'am," she said. The silence that followed was absolute. Nobody moved. The wind came off the mountain in a long, sustained push and moved through the group and kept going. Warren looked at her for another 3 seconds. Then she looked at Hargrove, who was standing at the far edge of the group with his hands behind his back and the expression of a man who has been waiting for a door to open. "Arrange it," Warren said. Hargrove nodded. Dorset, standing 6 feet to Delia's left, made a sound that wasn't quite a word, something between a breath and the beginning of a question that he didn't know how to finish because the ground he'd been standing on for 31 days had just shifted in a way he hadn't felt coming and hadn't braced for. She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes forward and her weight even on both feet despite what her left leg was telling her. And she stood in the cold mountain air while the command observers began the quiet, deliberate process of reassembling their understanding of everything they had watched over the past month. Because Major General Thessa Warren had just asked where Delia had trained, and Delia had declined to answer in public, and Hargrove had received the instruction to arrange a private meeting, and everyone present could feel, without being able to name it, that the exercise they just watched had not been a training exercise. It had been something else entirely. And the woman they had all been underestimating for 31 days had just made that visible in front of the 2 people with exactly the institutional authority to do something about it. The private meeting happened that afternoon, not in the briefing room, not in Hargrove's office. Warren had requested a space with no administrative record of occupancy, which told Delia something about what the general understood was at stake before a single word of the actual conversation had been spoken. They used a room at the back of the medical block, a storage space that had been converted at some point into a secondary consultation room and then apparently forgotten about, the kind of institutional space that exists in every large facility as a consequence of reorganizations that nobody fully followed through on. 2 folding chairs, a table with a scratch across the surface that someone had partially covered with a coffee cup ring, fluorescent light that flickered slightly on the left side. Warren sat. Hargrove stood near the door. Delia sat across from the general and put her hands flat on the table because she'd learned that people in positions of authority read hand placement, and flat on the table said, I have nothing to hide, and I'm not nervous more clearly than any amount of composed facial expression. Warren looked at her for a moment without speaking. She was 61, with the kind of face that had been through enough that it had stopped trying to look like anything other than what it was. Her uniform was impeccable, and her posture was the posture of someone who had been sitting correctly for so long it wasn't effort anymore. "Spectre Unit 8, she said. "No preamble? No warm-up?" "Yes, ma'am." "You're listed as deceased in the unit record." "Yes, ma'am." "Are you going to tell me how that happened, or do I need to pull the file?" "The file doesn't have the full account," Delia said. "The file was written by people who needed it to say something specific." Warren's expression didn't change. "Walk me through Sector 12. Delia looked at the table for a moment. Not hesitation. Organization. Some things needed to come out in the right order, or they didn't make sense. And this needed to make sense because she was only going to say it once in this room. Sector 12 was a 12-person direct action operation, she said. Target was a communications infrastructure node used by a non-state actor to coordinate financial transfers across 3 jurisdictions. The intelligence package was solid. We'd been building it for 8 months. The insertion window was a 48-hour opening in the target security rotation. "I know the overview," Warren said. "What's not in the file? What's not in the file is that we were compromised before insertion, not by the target, by the authorization chain. Someone with access to the operational order passed the insertion timeline to a third party. We went in on a window that had already been burned." Warren was very still. "We didn't know it was burned until we were inside," Delia continued. "By that point, the opposition wasn't the target security element. It was a prepared force, set up and waiting. They knew our approach vector, our entry points, our element breakdown." "Casualties," Warren said. 9 dead over 4 hours, 2 extracted with injuries. "Me." She paused. "The 2 who extracted didn't make it through the following month." The fluorescent light flickered on the left side. Nobody looked at it. "The after-action report," Warren said, "attributed the casualties to intelligence failure at the collection level, framed it as an analytical error, bad sourcing, incorrect pattern assessment, the kind of failure that happens, that is explainable, that doesn't require anyone above the operational tier to answer for anything. And you believe that account was deliberately constructed." "I know it was," Delia said, "because I was in the debrief when pieces of it were negotiated. Not the final version. I wasn't present for that. But I was in the room early enough to see what the account started as and to understand what it would need to become to protect whoever was above the operational tier." Warren looked at Hargrove. Hargrove looked at the wall. "Aldrich," Warren said. "One word. The tone of someone who has been patient for a long time and has decided the patience is finished. I became aware that the Sector 12 account had been shaped approximately 14 months ago," Hargrove said. He set it to the wall, then turned to face the room. "I identified a structural anomaly in the authorization chain documentation, a signature sequence that didn't match the operational timeline. The order to insert was issued 6 hours before the authorization board formally convened to approve it." Warren let a beat pass. "Someone signed off before the board met." "Yes." "That's not a procedural error." "No," Hargrove said. "It's not." Warren looked at Delia. "You have a name." "Hargrove gave me a name," Delia said. "Deputy Director Kaylin Morse, Defense Acquisition Oversight, former liaison to the Covert Operations Authorization Board." Warren's face did something subtle and controlled. The expression of someone who has just heard a name they already knew was coming and had been hoping wouldn't. "Morse," she said to herself, as much as to either of them. "You know him," Delia said. "I know of him." Warren put both hands on the table, flat, mirroring Delia's position in a way that was probably unconscious. "He's been in defense acquisition oversight for 11 years. He has institutional relationships that go wide." She paused. "What you're describing, if it's documented, is criminal authorization of an operation that resulted in 9 deaths and a cover-up that's been in place for 2 years." "Yes," Delia said, "if it's documented." "That's what I need," Delia said. "The signature sequence Hargrove identified is structural inference. I need the original authorization document, the one with the pre-board signature. That document exists. It was part of the operational package. It should be in the classified archive." "Should be," Warren said. "Or it was pulled," Delia said. which would itself be evidence. Warren looked at the table, a long look, the kind that meant internal calculation rather than external observation. Then she looked up. "Why the selection program?" she said. "Why this route? Why not go directly to the Inspector General, military justice, congressional oversight? There are channels." "I used the channels," Delia said, "for 18 months. The channels don't work when the person you're trying to report has relationships inside the channels." "Who specifically?" "The IG referral was closed without review. The officer who closed it was promoted 3 months later to a position that reports to Defense Acquisition Oversight." She paused. "I made 3 congressional referrals through intermediaries. 2 were never acknowledged. The third generated a response that indicated the matter had been reviewed and resolved, which was not possible because no review had occurred." Warren absorbed this with the expression of a person who is not surprised and is angry about not being surprised. "So you needed someone above the channels," Hargrove said from near the door. "Someone with the institutional standing to pull the archive directly without going through the standard request process, which is monitored." "Yes," Delia said. Warren looked at her directly. "And you believed I had that standing." "You have oversight authority over covert operations documentation," Delia said. "You can request the original authorization package for Sector 12 as part of a formal performance review of the operation. That's within your existing authority. It doesn't require a separate investigation to be opened. It doesn't generate the kind of flag in the system that would alert Morse before you had the document in hand." Warren said nothing for a moment. She was looking at Delia with an expression that had shifted. Still careful, still controlled, but carrying something underneath that was warmer than anything she'd shown since sitting down. Not warmth exactly. Recognition. The specific look of someone who has just understood what they're dealing with and found it to be something other than what was presented. "You planned this entire approach," Warren said. "The selection program, getting here day 31. "I needed you to see the performance record before I told you anything," Delia said. "If I'd come to you through an administrative channel, I'd have been a name on a referral document, a deceased operator making claims about a senior defense official. That's not hard to manage. But if I'd watched you for 31 days first, then I'm not a name on a document," Delia said. "I'm someone you've seen operate." Warren looked at Hargrove again. This time he met her eyes. "She's right," he said. Simply. Warren nodded, once, and stood up. So, what followed was not immediate. Nothing that mattered moved quickly inside institutional structures, which was something Delia had learned and relearned enough times that she'd stopped finding it frustrating and had started building it into her timelines as a fixed variable. She went back to the program. She attended the next 3 days of training blocks. She ate her meals, maintained her kit, let the hamstring recover on a modified load schedule that Garza had helped her construct without making it look like assistance. The formal resolution of Dorset's performance challenge came on day 33. Dismissed, with a notation in the evaluation record that the procedural deviation in the Phase 3 exercise had been reviewed by command observers and found to reflect appropriate tactical judgment. Dorset received the notification at the same time she did. She was across the mess tent when his aide handed him the paper, and she watched him read it from 30 feet away, watched the particular stillness that moved through his shoulders, watched him fold the paper with the careful movements of someone who is managing something they can't express in the current context. He didn't look at her. She went back to her tray. The meeting that mattered happened on day 35. Warren's aide found her during the afternoon communications block and said that the general requested her presence at 1900 in the administrative block. The aide said it the way aides communicate things that have been calibrated by the people who send them, neutrally, without giving anything away. At 1900, Delia walked into the administrative block and found Warren in Hargrove's office, which was now also occupied by a man she hadn't met, late 50s, civilian clothes, the kind of unremarkable appearance that in her experience usually indicated either genuine obscurity or deliberate construction. He was sitting in the chair to the right of Hargrove's desk with a tablet in his lap, and the expression of someone who had read a significant amount before arriving. "This is Vincent Okafor," Warren said. "He's with the Special Operations Accountability Division. He's been read into the Sector 12 file." Okafor looked at her with the careful eyes of someone whose professional life involved assessing whether the things people told him were true. "Sergeant Marsh." Mr. Okafor. Sit down, please. She sat. The office was small enough that the four of them created the slightly compressed atmosphere of people who were having a more significant conversation than the room was designed for. The archive request went in 36 hours ago, Warren said, through my operational review authority. The Sector 12 authorization package was retrieved this morning. Delia looked at her. The original authorization document has a pre-board signature, Warren said, exactly as Hargrove described. The signature belongs to Kaylin Morse. It's dated 6 hours and 40 minutes before the formal board convened. She'd known this. She had been operating on the assumption that this was true for 2 years, but hearing it confirmed in a room with witnesses had a different weight than carrying it as a theory. She felt the weight of it now. Not triumph, something heavier. The specific gravity of a thing finally becoming real. Is the document intact? She asked. No alterations? The document is intact, Okafor said. The digital metadata on the archive file shows it was accessed twice after the original filing, once as part of a standard archival review, once 14 months ago by a user account registered to an administrative assistant in Defense Acquisition Oversight. 14 months ago, Hargrove said, when I found the structural anomaly. Someone checked whether the document was still there, Delia said, and found that it was, Okafor said, but apparently decided that pulling it would create a larger flag than leaving it. Because a missing document is evidence, Delia said. A document that exists but that nobody can access is safer. Okafor nodded. Until someone with sufficient authority requests it through a legitimate channel. The room was quiet for a moment. What happens now? Delia said. Now it's no longer your problem, Warren said. The directness of it was not unkind. What you've brought us constitutes a foundation for a formal investigation through channels that Morse does not have visibility into. Okafor's division operates outside the standard reporting structure specifically to handle situations where the standard structure is compromised. Timeline, Delia said. These things move carefully, Okafor said. Fast enough that the target doesn't have time to prepare. Carefully enough that the case is intact when it gets to adjudication. Months, she said. Likely, he said, without apology. She nodded. She'd expected that. There's a secondary matter, Warren said. Her tone had shifted slightly. Not harder, but more deliberate, in the way that people shift tone when they're about to say something they've been deciding how to say. Your status in this program, Warren said. Your enrollment was under your service record, which lists you as deceased. That's a documentation issue that needs resolution regardless of the Sector 12 matter. I know. Resolving it means your name comes back into the active record. The people who benefited from the Sector 12 account believed there were no survivors. When your name reappears, Morse will know, Delia said. Potentially, Warren said, which is why the timing of that resolution needs to be coordinated with Okafor's investigation. We don't resurface you until the investigation is at a stage where Morse can't use the information to act. Delia looked at this window. The compound outside was dark, the perimeter lights running their reduced overnight circuit, the mountain invisible above the tree line but present. She could feel the altitude, the cold that came through the wall from outside, the specific pressure of elevation that you stopped consciously noticing after a few weeks, but that never actually went away. How long do I stay deceased? She said. 8 to 12 weeks, Okafor said. After that, we control the sequence. 8 to 12 weeks. She looked at the wall and ran the calculation without allowing her face to do anything in particular with it. 2 years she'd been carrying this. 8 to 12 more weeks was a specific and manageable number. Fine, she said. She left the meeting at 2010 and walked back through the compound toward the barracks, and the cold hit her when she came through the administrative block door with the specific force of a temperature drop that had deepened while she'd been inside. She stood for a moment on the step outside, letting her eyes adjust to the outdoor light level and her body adjust to the temperature. Culver was leaning against the wall 6 feet to her right. She hadn't heard him arrive, which was either because she'd been inside her own head or because Culver moved quietly when he chose to, which she suspected was most of the time. How'd it go? He said. Well, he nodded. He was looking at the compound the way he looked at most things, with the settled attention of someone who had been in enough places that new environments stopped creating noise. Warren's thorough, he said. She doesn't move on something unless she intends to finish it. That's what I needed, Delia said. And Okafor? She looked at him. You know Okafor. I know of him, Culver said, in exactly the same register Warren had used about Morse, which she recognized as the institutional language for, I know enough to have an opinion that I'm not going to share in full. He's credible, she said. Culver nodded again. He pushed off the wall and turned up the collar of his jacket against the wind. Dorset's submitting a voluntary withdrawal. She blinked. When did that happen? This evening, after the challenge dismissal. Culver said it without commentary, as if he were reading a weather report. Renwick is staying, for what that's worth. She thought about Dorset for a moment, not with satisfaction, because satisfaction would require caring more about Dorset's arc than her own, and she had other things that required the attention. She thought about him with something closer to practical acknowledgement. He had read the situation wrong from the first day and had kept reading it wrong through 35 days of evidence to the contrary, and that was its own form of information. His call, she said. Yes, Culver said. It is. He started to walk away, then stopped. Marsh. She looked at him. The program ends in 3 weeks, he said. You finish it. Whatever else is in motion, you finish the program. It wasn't an order. It was something that occupied the space between an order and a request, the way the things that actually mattered usually did. I intend to, she said. Voss came to find her on day 38, not in the corridor this time, in the evaluation bay after the last training block of the day, when most of the trainees had cleared out and the space had that hollow, equipment smell quality of rooms that have been used hard and left empty. Delia was doing her post-block kit check, the routine that had become automatic, each item confirmed in the same sequence, the backup components verified in order. She heard Voss come in but didn't look up from the kit. Voss stood about 6 feet away and was quiet for a moment. The fluorescent lights in the bay hummed at a frequency that was only noticeable in silence. The challenge dismissal, Voss said. Yes. The command observer involvement. Yes. You want to tell me that you planned this, Voss said. The whole 35 days. Delia set down the compass she'd been checking and looked at her. I came here to complete selection, she said. Everything else was responsive to what the environment produced. Voss looked at her with the expression she'd been wearing since day 29 or so. The revised assessment face, the one that had replaced the earlier version and hadn't fully settled into a stable form yet. She was working something out and hadn't finished. The complaint, she said, the formal response you submitted. Yes. It wasn't a defense document, Voss said. It was a record. It was both, Delia said, but primarily a record. Voss looked at the floor, then back up. You weren't trying to clear your name. You were building documentation for something else. Delia said nothing. Voss made a sound that was short and controlled and carried more self-directed weight than anything aimed outward. I underestimated what I was dealing with. Yes, Delia said. She didn't add anything to it because softening it would have been less respectful than saying it plainly. Voss absorbed that. Her jaw worked slightly. The kit sabotage. You documented it in the challenge response. Yes. You know who did it? I have a reasonable inference. You didn't report it. No. Why not? Because reporting it would have required a formal process, Delia said. A formal process would have taken time and attention I didn't have, and would have produced a finding that was ambiguous at best because there were no witnesses. The documentation was more useful than the report. Voss looked at her for a long moment. The documentation is more useful because it establishes a pattern, she said slowly. A pattern that now exists in an official record that can be read alongside everything else that happened in this program. Yes, that's a very particular way to think, Voss said. Not admiration, something more complicated than admiration. It's the way I think, Delia said. Voss nodded once with the decisive movement of someone closing something rather than opening it. The final evaluation block is day 42, she said. My assessment is the primary record. I know. My assessment will reflect what I've observed, Voss said. All of it, including the last 5 days. Delia looked at her directly. Voss met her eyes and held them, and what was in them was not warmth. Probably never going to be warmth, and that was fine. But it was the specific quality of a person who has revised their position and is committed to the revision, who has enough integrity to let the new assessment override the old one, even when the old one was more comfortable. "Thank you," Delia said. "Don't thank me," Voss said. "It's just the accurate record." She left. Delia went back to her kit check, working through the remaining items in sequence, compass to radio to headlamp to the backup components in the secondary compartment. Outside the bay windows, the mountain was doing what the mountain did, sitting in the dark, cold and indifferent, not caring about anything that had happened in the buildings at its base. She could hear the wind picking up in the pines on the slope above, the sound of it like something breathing at a scale that made the buildings feel very small. 3 weeks left. Morse was still at his desk somewhere in a building she'd never entered, still holding the position he'd held for 11 years, still surrounded by the institutional relationships that had made him feel protected. He didn't know that a woman he'd written off as a statistic in a formatted report had spent 2 years building a route to the one document that could take him apart. He didn't know that the route was complete. He didn't know that the people who now had the document were the people who could actually use it. She finished the kit check, confirmed all items, closed the bag with the systematic care of someone for whom this routine had become a kind of anchor, the sequence that meant you are ready, you are not exposed, you have what you need. She picked up the bag and walked out of the evaluation bay, and her left leg carried her without protest for the first time in 11 days, and the compound outside was dark and cold and very quiet. And 3 weeks from now, she was going to walk out of Fort Vanthorpe with a selection record that nobody could touch. And somewhere in a classified archive that Kaylin Morse had checked 14 months ago and decided was safely inaccessible, a document with his signature sat in the hands of people who knew exactly what it meant. The waiting was almost over. She could feel it the way you feel a shift in weather before it arrives. Not yet visible, but present in the air, in the pressure, in the specific quality of the silence before something significant stops being future and becomes now. The last 3 weeks of Vanthorpe selection passed the way the end of hard things usually passes, faster than expected, and with a different texture from everything that came before, because the knowing it was almost over changed the quality of the experience even when the physical demand stayed the same. Delia ran the final training blocks with her hamstring at roughly 80%, which was enough. She navigated the last night land course clean. She led the final communications exercise with the specific economy of someone who had stopped performing competence and was simply expressing it. The other trainees around her had changed in the way that cohorts change when they've been through enough together. The early social architecture mostly dissolved, replaced by something more honest and less comfortable. The kind of provisional respect that comes from watching people function under sustained pressure. Garza ran alongside her on the final physical assessment, a 6-kilometer course with elevation gain, and didn't say much during the run itself, which was how she preferred it. At the finish, he was breathing hard and she was breathing hard, and they stood for a moment with their hands on their knees before straightening up. "You going to tell me what actually happened?" he said. "At the senior observer meeting." "No," she said. He nodded like he'd expected that. "Fair enough. You did good work in this program," she said. It came out more directly than she'd intended, but it was accurate, so she left it. He looked at her sideways. "Did that just cost you something to say?" "A little," she said. He laughed, the same short, real laugh from week 2. "Yeah, you too, Marsh." The final evaluation results were posted on day 42 at 800 on the board outside the administrative block, in the way that Vanthorpe had apparently been posting results since the program began. A single printed sheet in a plastic sleeve, names and assessment outcomes in alphabetical order, no commentary. She checked her result the way she checked most things, once, directly, without ceremony. Her name was there. The assessment notation beside it was the highest available rating in the program's evaluation framework. Below it, in the notes field that was usually left blank, Voss had written 4 words. Exceptional tactical judgment demonstrated. 4 words. From Voss. She read them twice and then walked away from the board, and she did not look back at it. The program completion ceremony was brief and functional, which suited everyone. Hargrove presided. The remaining 15 trainees stood in formation on the parade ground where she had first stood 6 weeks ago in the pre-dawn cold with laughter moving through the line around her. The ground was still frozen. The mountain above the tree line was visible in the morning light, gray-white and enormous. The kind of scale that made the compound look like something temporary placed at its base without permission. Hargrove moved down the line, shaking hands with each graduate. He reached her and paused, the way he hadn't paused for anyone else. Not long, not theatrically, just the half-second of a man acknowledging something specific. "Well done, Sergeant," he said. "Thank you, sir." He held her hand for exactly one extra beat. His eyes said what the formal context didn't permit his voice to say. She received it and let it go. He moved on. Garza, 2 positions to her left, caught her eye briefly when Hargrove passed him. He had the expression of someone who had noticed the pause and had filed it under things I'm not going to ask about with the mature discipline of a person who had learned when to stop pulling on threads. After the ceremony, in the brief milling period before people dispersed, Solis found her. "Where do you go from here?" Solis asked. "Reassignment," Delia said. "Yours?" "Advanced signals course, then probably somewhere cold." Solis looked at her with the direct, considering gaze she'd had since the first week. "I don't know what you were actually doing here. I don't think it was just selection." "Selection was part of it," Delia said, "but not all of it." "No." Solis nodded. She put out her hand and Delia shook it, and the handshake was firm and unambiguous in the way that things are when people have stopped pretending to be something they aren't around each other. "Good luck," Solis said. "Same," Delia said. Solis walked away toward the parking area, and Delia watched her go with the specific feeling of meeting someone you'd have liked to know better in different circumstances. The feeling didn't need to be acted on. It was just true. The call from Okafor came 11 weeks after she left Vanthorpe. She was at a temporary posting at a training facility in the eastern part of the country, a role that existed on paper as an instructor position and in practice as a holding pattern, while the documentation issues around her status were carefully resolved in the background. She'd been living in a one-room unit on the facility grounds, running fitness sessions with junior trainees in the mornings, spending the afternoons in the kind of administrative work that she was overqualified for, and that she did anyway because it was what was available. The call came at 14:30 on a Tuesday. Okafor's voice was the same as it had been in the medical block room at Vanthorpe, careful, measured, without performing either good news or bad news before he was ready to deliver which one it was. "The investigation closed this morning," he said. She was sitting at the small desk in her unit. She set down the pen she'd been holding. "And," she said, Deputy Director Kaylin Morse was placed on administrative suspension at 800. The suspension is public record as of noon today. The formal charges will be filed within 72 hours. That timeline is coordinated with the Justice Division." He paused. "The charges include criminal authorization of a covert operation outside proper oversight, falsification of official military records, and obstruction of internal investigation. The Sector 12 operation is specifically named." She sat very still. Not because she was surprised, because she had been carrying the weight of this for 2 years, and the weight was lifting, and the body needed a moment to remember what it felt like to carry less. "The names of the Sector 12 casualties," she said. "Will they be part of the public record?" "As part of the formal charges, yes. Their operational records will be corrected. The deceased designation on your record will be rescinded simultaneously." Another pause. "You'll be officially alive again as of 800 tomorrow." She almost said something and then didn't. There was a category of response to this particular piece of information that she didn't have language for, so she didn't try to force language onto it. "There's one more thing," Okafor said. She waited. "The officer who closed the IG referral without review," he said. "The one who was promoted afterward. That promotion is under review. The 2 congressional referrals that were never acknowledged. There's now a formal inquiry into how they were managed." He paused again, and this pause was slightly different from the others. It had the quality of someone choosing their words because the words mattered. The people who helped make the Sector 12 account hold for 2 years are not going to have an easy several months. Bigta. She looked at the wall of the small room. It was a plain wall, institutional paint, a shade of off-white that wasn't quite any specific color. She'd been looking at it for 11 weeks. "Thank you," she said, "for the work." "You built the foundation," Okafor said. "We followed it." He ended the call. She sat at the desk for a moment, not moving. Then she picked up the pen and set it down again because she didn't actually have anything to write. She went to the window and looked at the training ground outside. Junior trainees running a circuit in the afternoon light, the instructor calling intervals at the far end, the sound of boots on packed dirt carrying clearly in the cold air. She stayed at the window for a while, not thinking exactly, just letting the information settle into the right places. The correction to her service record was processed at 800 the following morning, and the first person who reached her about it was not Okafor, not Warren, not anyone from the investigation. It was Hargrove. He sent a message through the official channel, brief, 4 lines, the language of a formal communication that was doing work that formal language wasn't quite designed for. "The correction has been processed. The record is accurate. Well done. Hargrove." She read it once and then sat with it for a moment before composing a response that was equally brief. "Thank you for the equipment shed." She sent it and didn't wait for a reply. The news about Morse moved through institutional channels first, and then, gradually, into the wider visibility of things that become public record when charges are filed. She wasn't connected to the public-facing version of it. Her name didn't appear in the initial reporting, by design, and she hadn't expected it to. The investigation had been constructed to be about the act and the authorization, not about the survivor who had uncovered it. That was deliberate. It was also, she'd decided, correct. She didn't need her name in the account. She needed the account to be accurate. 3 weeks after Okafor's call, she was summoned to a meeting in a building she'd never been in a city she'd only passed through once, by a set of travel orders that described her destination as a routine administrative conference. The building was 6 floors of glass and concrete on the edge of a federal district, the kind of building that housed a large number of offices that didn't advertise what they did. The meeting room on the 4th floor had actual windows, which she noticed because most meeting rooms in buildings like this didn't, and coffee that was better than anything she'd encountered in 6 weeks at a temporary posting. Warren was there. Okafor was there. There were 2 other people she didn't recognize. A man and a woman, both in civilian clothes, both with the bearing of people who operated in institutional contexts that didn't require uniforms. She sat down. "The charges against Morse were formally filed this morning," Warren said. "The public record is accurate and will remain so regardless of how the legal proceedings develop. The Sector 12 operation is documented, named, and officially recognized as an unauthorized action that resulted in the deaths of 9 operators." Delia nodded. "The correction to your record is complete and permanent," Warren continued. "Your operational history with Spectre Unit 8 has been restored. Your service record now reflects your actual service." "Including the years I was officially dead," Delia said. "Including those years," Warren said. "Credited in full." She looked at the table. There was a scratch on it, diagonal, near the left edge. She focused on it briefly the way you focus on small, specific things when larger things are being settled around you. "There's a question on the table," Warren said, "and it's yours to answer." Delia looked up. "The program you've demonstrated capacity for, the kind of thinking, the planning, the operational patience, there's a role that's been unfilled for 14 months in a unit that doesn't appear in any public directory. It operates under the oversight structure that Okafor's division falls within, which means it has the kind of accountability that Spectre 8 didn't have." Warren paused. "The role involves identifying and resolving situations where institutional structures have been compromised in ways that standard processes can't address." Delia looked at her for a moment. "That's a careful description." "It's an accurate one." "How many people in the unit?" "Small," the woman Delia didn't recognize said. It was the first thing she'd said. Her voice was steady and direct. 6 currently. The selection for this role is what you just went through, among other things. The Vanthorpe program was part of the selection, Delia said. "Part of it," the woman said. "The 2 years before it were also part of it. We were watching the IG referral. We were aware of the congressional referrals and how they were managed. We needed to know whether the person pursuing this would pursue it correctly." Delia absorbed this. You let it run for 2 years to assess my methodology. We let it run, the woman said, because we couldn't move on Morse without the foundation you were building. And yes, how you built it mattered. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the city moved in its ordinary way. Traffic, movement, the visible surface of a world that had no idea what was happening 4 floors above it. If I take this role, Delia said, the people I work with. Cleared at the highest level, Okafor said, vetted by a process that doesn't have the vulnerabilities the standard process has. And oversight. Genuine oversight, Warren said, not the kind Morse was supposed to provide. Delia looked at the window for a moment. She thought about the barracks at Vanthorpe, the dark, the cold, the sound of 20 people breathing in the night. She thought about 9 names on a record that had said deceased and meant inconvenient. She thought about 2 years of carrying something that nobody with the authority to act on it would touch, and the particular grinding patience that had been required to find a route around every wall that had been placed between her and the document that mattered. She thought about Garza's laugh in the second week, about Solis's handshake at the end, about Culver on the perimeter road saying, "Finish the program," like it was the most obvious thing in the world. She looked back at Warren. "Yes," she said. There were logistics. There were always logistics. The formal paperwork took 2 weeks, during which she remained at the temporary posting and ran fitness sessions in the mornings and sat with the knowledge of what was coming without telling anyone about it, because there was no one to tell who would have understood what to do with the information. She called nobody. She wrote one message to Hargrove through the formal channel, 4 lines. The role is accepted. Thank you for the 31 days the foundation held. Marsh. His reply came within the hour. It was always going to. Good luck. She read it and felt something settle in her chest, not the relief of something ending, but the specific quiet of something completed. Hargrove had taken a real risk in that equipment shed. He had designed a day 31 exercise around a person he hadn't yet fully confirmed. He had vouched for something he could only partially verify. That kind of risk, extended by someone with his institutional standing, was not a small thing. It was the kind of thing you carried accurately. She carried it accurately. The day she left the temporary posting, Garza was there. Not planned. He was at the facility for an advanced course that had started that week, and she ran into him in the parking area with her bag over her shoulder and her discharge paperwork in her left hand. He looked at the bag. He looked at the paperwork. He looked at her. "You're leaving," he said. "Yes." "New assignment?" "Yes." He waited a beat, recognized that more information wasn't coming, and nodded in the way he'd learned to nod when she wasn't going to tell him something. "Good assignment?" "Yes," she said. "Good assignment." He stood for a moment with his hands in his jacket pockets. The parking area light was the particular flat gray of an overcast morning, the kind of light that made everything look equally significant and equally ordinary. A wind came through from the north, cold and steady, the kind she'd been feeling for the better part of 3 months. "You know," he said, "I spent the first week at Vanthorpe thinking you were going to wash out." "I know," she said. "And then I spent the next 5 weeks not being able to figure you out." "I know that too." He looked at her with the direct, thoughtful gaze that had been one of the more reliable things in the program. "I still can't, really," he said, "figure you out." "That's fine," she said. He smiled, not the short, surprised laugh, something quieter. "Take care of yourself, Marsh." "You too, Garza." She walked to the vehicle that was waiting for her, put her bag in the back, and got in without looking back. Kalen Morse was formally charged on a Thursday morning in a federal filing that generated 2 paragraphs in the institutional reporting channels and a longer article in one outlet that covered defense accountability. The article named the Sector 12 operation, named the 9 operators who had died, and described the core allegation, unauthorized operational authorization followed by a falsified after-action account, with the kind of specificity that comes from a well-constructed formal filing rather than a leak. Delia read the article on her phone in the back of the vehicle, somewhere on a highway between the temporary posting and her new assignment. She read it once, all the way through, with the careful attention she gave to things that had required significant investment to bring into existence. The 9 names were listed in the 3rd paragraph. in order of rank. She had known all of them. Not all of them well. Operational units at that level didn't always produce close relationships, because the work made closeness complicated in specific ways. But she had known their faces, their professional habits, the particular ways each of them functioned under pressure. She had known that none of them had been given the chance to fail on their own terms. They'd been handed to a prepared force by someone who sat in a climate-controlled office and signed his name on a document 6 hours and 40 minutes before the board that was supposed to authorize it ever convened. Now his name was in a federal filing, and their names were accurate on a public record. It wasn't the same thing as what had been taken from them. She didn't believe in that kind of arithmetic, but it was the correct thing, made to happen by the people with the standing to make it happen, and the route to getting them there had been built by someone who had been told, in 100 different institutional languages, that she didn't belong in any room where decisions got made. She put her phone away. Outside the vehicle window, the landscape was doing what landscapes did, moving past without knowing it was being observed, indifferent to what was happening inside the glass. Fields, tree lines, the occasional cluster of buildings that represented someone's ordinary life going forward at its ordinary pace. She looked at it for a while. Then she took out the small notebook she carried and opened it to a blank page and began writing. Not a plan, not a document, not anything that served an instrumental purpose. Just the names. All 9 of them, in the order she remembered them, which was not the same as rank order, but was the order they'd come back to her over 2 years when she'd needed to remember what she was doing this for. She wrote all 9 and then closed the notebook and put it in her left cargo pocket against her chest, where it would stay until she had a better place for it. The new unit operated out of a building that was accurately described as unremarkable, in a location that she agreed not to name in any context, among 5 other people who had each arrived there through a different version of the same kind of route, the kind that required you to prove something before anyone would open the door. The woman from the meeting room, whose name turned out to be Declan, which was not the name Delia had expected, but people were rarely what their names suggested anyway, briefed her on the unit's current caseload on the first morning. 3 active situations, 2 in early assessment, one that had been running for 8 months and was approaching the kind of stage that Sector 12 had been approaching when Delia walked into Fort Vanthorpe. "The 8-month case," Delia said. "What's the core documentation gap?" Declan looked at her with the evaluating expression of someone deciding how much to accelerate the onboarding process. Then she pulled a folder from the left side of the table and slid it across. "We've been trying to access an archive," Declan said. "The request keeps hitting a wall in the standard process." Delia opened the folder. She read the first page. She read the second page. She looked at the authorization chain structure on the third page and felt the particular click of a familiar pattern presenting itself in a new configuration. The same structural signature, the same type of anomaly, the same kind of construction that was designed to be difficult to read unless you knew what you were looking for. She knew what she was looking for. "Who has the authority to request this archive outside the standard process?" she asked. "That's the problem," Declan said. "The standard path is compromised. We need a non-standard entry point." Delia looked at the folder. Then she looked at Declan. "Give me a week," she said. Declan studied her for a moment. Then she nodded. A single, decisive nod, the kind that meant, "I believe you can do what you're saying you can do, and I'm going to hold you to that." "1 week," she said. Delia closed the folder and held it with both hands and looked at the plain wall of the briefing room. A different wall, a different room, a different city, but the same essential territory that she'd been navigating since the moment she walked out of a basement debrief 2 years ago, with a name that nobody would help her pursue and a set of options that were all closed except the ones she was willing to build herself. She'd built them. Everyone. That evening, she walked out of the building alone, into a city that was doing what cities did in the early dark of an autumn evening, moving, lit, producing the low continuous sound of many separate lives going forward simultaneously. She walked for 20 minutes without direction, which was something she rarely allowed herself but occasionally needed, because the forward-oriented discipline that made her functional under sustained pressure had a cost, and the cost was that sometimes you had to put it down briefly or it became all you were. She walked past a coffee place with fogged windows and people visible inside at small tables, and she almost kept walking, and then didn't. She went in. She ordered coffee she didn't need and sat at a table near the window, and looked at the street and let her mind do whatever it wanted to for 15 minutes. It went to the parade ground at Vanthorpe, the pre-dawn cold, the laughter moving through the line while she stood at attention with her sleeve rolled and the mountain at her back. She thought about what that woman had felt standing in that yard. Not wounded, she'd been past wounded by then, but aware, in the specific way of someone who has been told by enough different systems that they don't belong somewhere, that the awareness itself had become a kind of preparation. Every dismissal had been information. Every attempt to push her out had been documentation. Every person who had laughed had been, without knowing it, building the case that would eventually be used to stand in front of two generals and say, "I have been here, I have performed. Now listen." She hadn't known then whether it would work. That was the part nobody told you about this kind of patient, grinding effort. You did it without knowing whether the door would open, because the alternative was not doing it, and not doing it meant 9 names stayed wrong on a record and 1 man stayed comfortable in a climate-controlled office, and the thing that had happened continued to be described as something it wasn't. The door had opened, not because she had been exceptional, not because everything had gone according to plan, because nothing had gone entirely according to plan, because she had kept moving when the terrain was wrong and kept building when the tools were inadequate and had not, at any point in 2 years, allowed the accumulated weight of what had been done to her to become heavier than the reason she was carrying it. She finished her coffee, left the place and walked back to the building and went up to the room she'd been assigned, which had a window and a desk and a bed and nothing else yet but would accumulate the things that rooms accumulate when someone actually lives in them. She put the notebook on the desk, the one with the 9 names. She put her hand on it for a moment. Then she sat down at the desk, opened the folder Declan had given her, and went back to work. The raven on her arm had been put there in a context she couldn't discuss, by someone who hadn't survived the year following, as a permanent record of belonging to something that had been designed to be invisible. For 2 years, it had been a liability, a marking that identified her as someone who should officially no longer exist, that could give her away to the wrong person in the wrong room. At Vanthorpe, it had been the mechanism. Standing at attention on a frozen parade ground while laughter moved through the line, it had been the thing that everyone looked at and failed to read correctly, because they were reading the surface and she was carrying the interior. She wasn't the woman they had laughed at. She was the reason the laughter stopped. And in the end, that was enough. Not because it was satisfying in the simple way that simple things are satisfying, but because the 9 people whose names she'd written in a notebook had deserved someone who would keep going past every wall, past every closed channel, past every institutional structure designed to make the truth inconvenient, all the way to the room where the document lived, and the people who could act on it were finally sitting across a table willing to listen. She had been that someone. Not because she was fearless, she'd been afraid, in the equipment shed, on the perimeter road, in the small hours of a dozen nights when the forward path wasn't visible and the weight of what she was carrying felt like too much for the route ahead. Because she went anyway. The most dangerous thing you can do to a person who dismisses you is simply refuse to disappear and keep building in the dark until the truth you're carrying is too solid for anyone to deny.